Thanks, Chairman. I'd like to welcome all the delegations in. I have a number of questions for Dr. Davis. There's been a number of models mentioned, Scottish model and Welsh model and different things. In terms of your studies, have you compared EU partners to Ireland in terms of what is the best model in terms of procurement? And secondly, do you believe there needs to be a separate working group for the micro businesses, similar to the guidelines for the SMEs in terms of Circular 1014? To IBEC, in terms of the size of a company, can you estimate what figure? Can you establish what figure you use in terms of what comprises an SME? Now, you sit on the SME working group. Have you made suggestions to the department in terms of a similar group for micro businesses, and that would be something that you would agree to? You stated that the Circular 1014 has not been fully implemented. We've heard here today that it's been totally ignored. Would you like to comment just on that? To Paul Quinn, and what's that old saying, lies, damn lies and statistics, and I know Deputy Tobin has touched on some of the things there in relation to the amount of Irish companies that are winning Irish procurement, and I quoted figures earlier in relation to from Minister Howland last June that in excess of 95% of public procurement in Ireland is won by Irish companies. So that tallies with the 5% figure that you quoted earlier. So do you stand over those figures by the Minister? He said less than 5% of overall public procurement is now won by foreign companies, 95% by Irish companies, 75% of which are SMEs, and that this figure for last year, up from 60% in 2012. So just would question, would you stand over those figures, because they have been disputed, and again, it comes down to the methodology of assessing them. The Minister also said that, you know, in relation to the 2.4, there's about 2.4 trillion EU public tendering market. How have the changes, have they better enabled Irish companies, or do you see, would that be an aim in terms of the amalgamations and and that to try and get some of that public procurement? Is that actually working? Is there any evidence of that, or is that just something that we would aspire to? Just two other things. We've heard real examples here today of, you know, you might save on one hand as the state 5 or 6% has been quoted here in relation to a tender, but on the other hand we're losing jobs. Obviously the impact that has on those employees, but also the fact that businesses in some cases are closing, lost to the state in terms of revenues, in terms of taxes, in terms of VAT, in terms of rates to local authorities. So is there any methodology to take those sort of issues into account in relation to the tendering process? And also to yourself, a similar question that I asked IBEC. Circular 1014, is it being implemented or is it being totally ignored, as has been suggested as well?
Okay, Dr. Davis.
Okay, look, first of all, in terms of models, in a recent review that I carried out for Enterprise Ireland, I reviewed the models in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England and Northern Ireland. And in adopting it, one model came across, which was the local multiplier methodology, and it answers a number of questions in terms of what you've raised. And it looks at developing local economic benefits. So it's used as a measure in terms of awarding contracts, so that you look at the local economic benefits for investment by public authorities. So it can be built in as part of the MEET criteria, the most economically advantageous tender. And that takes into account how organisations re-spend their money back into a local economy. In the UK, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies with local authorities found that small firms will re-spend 49p in every pound they receive back in the local economy, whereas large firms will re-spend 31p in every pound back in the local economy. So there are models there, and there are models in action at this point in time, and they're being adopted throughout the UK and rolled out in terms of saying there is a better way of doing this. And if we look at small companies, yes, we can actually put an economic value back on what the spend will be locally. The second question that you asked was in terms of a separate working group for micro enterprises. I think it's worth observing, and I want to just again go back maybe to the first question in terms of figures and stats that are out there. We've been running with the NPS and the OGP for the last 3 years a survey through e-tenders, trying to get a percentage of what way the market is made up and what the reactions of buyers are. On average, in 2011, 2012, 2013, 14, 50 to 51% of companies bidding in for tenders are micro enterprises. That means they employ less than 10 people. They employ between 1 and 9 people. Current policies are addressed at small to medium-sized enterprises, which starts moving from the 10 and above upwards to 250. So literally, should we have something representing 50% of the companies bidding in, certainly it should be considered, and certainly policy should be looked at. In terms of why, and we need to look at just the answer to that in terms of where they're competing, 30% over the 3-year period, 30% of companies bidding in for local business are bidding in for business within 120 kilometres of their home base. 120 kilometres. Only 20% of all businesses that came through and replied to e-tenders, I'll give you some of the figures in terms of the replies, only 20% consistently over the 3 years are looking for business outside the Irish economy. Okay, in public sector procurement, only 20% are actually actively looking outside the Irish economy. So when we hear policy stating that we're actually driving public procurement to drive export, there is only 20% of companies competing for public procurement business actually interested in driving an export. The other 80% is actually interested in competing nationally. But it is important to note that 50% are micro enterprises, and that 30% of the total respondents coming back in are only interested in doing business within 120. So where we have national policies, centralised policies, we run the risk of alienating those small businesses. We run the risk of not having them participate. And that's a risk that has to be taken into account. So should we have something that represents those, certainly we should be considering them as part of policy, and there should be a more proactive approach.
Mr. Quinn.